Hello everyone, I'm Derek Tilley, manager of the Aberdeen Plant Materials Center, and in this video we are going to cover identification of some common restoration and weedy grasses of the semi-arid sites in the Intermountain West. We are going to talk a lot about grass, so brace yourselves. So if you're going to be doing a lot of grass identification or any real plant identification using the botanical keys and the regional floras, I highly recommend getting this book by Harris and Harris, Plant Identification Terminology. It has excellent line drawings of every botanical term and a brief description of what that means. And this goes for every flower part, leaf part, different hairs, what have you. It's an excellent book. You can have it right next to you while you're keying something out. I find it very useful, so I highly recommend this. I also recommend the Field Guide to Wyoming Grasses by Quentin Skinner. I believe he also has a book for Nevada out now. It has excellent photographs of the different grasses, close-ups of seeds, florets, collars and ligules, everything you need to do identification. So I really like this book, and if you can't identify a grass by using the key, it's pretty easy to just flip through this book and find the picture that matches your sample. So good book to have with you. So a lot of people get intimidated by grasses. There's a lot of anxiety when it comes to identifying grasses. So we're going to just start out comparing grass parts to the normal flower parts. And I think you'll find that it's not so different. There's a few little modifications and a few new terms to remember, but otherwise they're not that terrible. So in this picture on the left, you see, if you come up from the stem below, you reach the first whorl of flower parts that we call sepals, and the second whorl we call petals. And then you find the male reproductive organs, which are the stamens consisting of the anthers and filaments. And then in the center we've got the female parts, the carpel, consisting of the ovary, the style, and the stigma. And in the grass flower on the right, it's very similar. If you come up from the base, instead of hitting sepals and petals, you're going to hit some modified structures that are called loticules. But honestly, those are so small that you rarely will ever see them or need need to identify them to identify your grass. And then same as in the normal flower, the next thing you come to is the male structures, the stamen, and then you've got the ovary, style, and stigma in the center. And grasses always have a bilobed stigma with two feathery stigmatic lobes coming out the top. So if you look at the picture on the left, we've got what would be considered a normal flowering stem. And you start with just two basic normal leaves at the bottom, and in grasses those have been changed. Their name is now called a glume, and you run into the lower glume or the first glume, and then you hit the upper or second glume. And then at the next junction or node, you're going to run into a flower, and on the left it's subtended by two leaves, and on the right in the grass stem, those leaves have been modified into what we call a lemma and a palea. And you can see the flower parts there in the center. And then all the different flowers are separated by small sections of stem that in grasses are called the rachilla. So if you start on the right and look at the close-up of the flower, you see again the loticule, the stamens, and then the ovary in the middle. And then you go up to the next image, and that flower is surrounded by those modified leaves called the lemma and palea. The lemma is always the outer one, palea is the inner one. And then that structure there, lemma, palea, and the flower inside it, that's called a floret. And several florets, or a group of florets subtended by glumes, which again are those modified leaf structures, that unit, the glumes to the last floret, would be called a spikelet. And then a group or an order of spikelets on a plant would just be called the inflorescence, the whole flowering event. So again here, coming up from the bottom, we hit the first glume, then the second glume, which are those modified leaf structures, then the floret, which is the lemma and palea and the flower stuck inside it, and then several florets separated by small sections of stem called rachilla. In grasses, we have a few different inflorescence types that we need to worry about. The first one is a panicle, which is a much branched inflorescence. So you see it's got the main stem running up the middle, and then it's got branching coming off of that, and then another set of branches coming off of that. That's a panicle. And typically you would be able to see those branches, say if you held that stem out at arm's length, but sometimes you need to get your teasing needle and separate those branches out. They might not be obvious. The second kind of inflorescence is a raceme, which is slightly less branched than the panicle, so it's a main stem and then branches coming off of it, or just the spikelets coming off of that main branch. So you see there in B, you've got a main stem and several smaller branches, but those branches are not branched themselves. And then finally, C is a spike or a spicate raceme, which just means one long terminal inflorescence. So on the left, we've got crested wheatgrass, which is a spike or a spicate raceme. And then on the right, we've got Kentucky bluegrass, which is a panicle. You can see again, it has multiple branches, which are again branched after that. Some other things to consider or that you might need to know. You'll find this step in several keys, asking if the spikelets are laterally or dorsoventrally compressed. If they're laterally compressed, meaning squished from the sides of the spikelet, the florets will be several in that spikelet, 2 to several, and they will reduce upward, meaning they get less mature the further from the stem you go. And they typically disarticulate or break off the plant above the glumes. If they're dorsoventrally compressed, there's usually only 1, maybe 2 florets per spikelet, and they're reduced below, meaning the immature or infertile floret is going to be down inside the glumes below the main fertile floret. Most of our grasses in the Intermountain West are going to be laterally compressed. There are some of the dorsoventrally compressed group, so you still need to know this step. You can't ignore it altogether, but most will be laterally compressed. So here on the left, we've got a bluegrass spikelet, and again, the bottom 2 structures of that spikelet are the glumes, and then you've got 2 to several florets inside there, reducing upward, meaning the further you go from the stem, the less mature they become. And if you were to lay that whole spikelet down on the table, it would fall on one side or the other. Now on the right, we've got a foxtail spikelet, and it is dorsoventrally compressed. So if you were to lay that on the table, it would rest naturally on its belly or on its back. And if it had 2 florets in that spikelet, the second one would be down inside the glumes, down below where you couldn't see it. So it's reducing closer to the stem instead of going away from the stem. And remember, this step is always talking about the whole spikelet, not just one floret. So you have to have the glumes there to make this work. We'll also want to know some terminology for the vegetative parts of the grass. So here we've got a section of stem and leaf, starting at the bottom with the node, which is where the leaf arises. And then that leaf follows the stem and clasps the stem for a good length, and that's called the sheath. And then the sheath, the leaf breaks away from the stem and that's what we call the actual blade, or what we typically call the leaf. That sheath will have a margin. It could be overlapping or open. And then at that area where the sheath breaks away from the blade, or the blade leaves the stem, we call that whole region the collar. And the collar could have those finger-like appendages we call auricles that wrap around the stem. If you pull the upper section of stem out of the lower portion of stem, you will see what we call a ligule gets left behind. The ligule can be membranous, or it can be made of hairs, or it can be a membrane tipped with hairs. It becomes an important part of the plant to help identify different grasses. And then you might run into different hairs or roughness along the blade or on the blade margin. So good to have this region in your sample if you bring home a specimen and want to key it out or identify it later. So again, auricles can be present or absent. The ligule could be absent, it could be hairy, it could be membranous. The blade itself could be hairy all over, could be hairy just on the margins, could be smooth, flat, rolled, or keeled like the front of a boat or the bottom of a boat. And then that sheath could be open, closed, overlapping, hairy, or lacking hairs. So here on the left we have jointed goat grass. You can see on the stem it has a closed sheath. It's got some hairs along the sheath margin that are kind of overlapping, and then as you go up to the collar region, you see some not really well developed auricles, but you kind of get the idea there. And then the upper portion of stem has been removed, and you can see the membranous ligule that's left behind. And then you've got some really good stout hairs along the leaf margin that are quite conspicuous, and you can see some really definite veins on the leaf blade itself. And then on the right we have green foxtail, and the first thing to notice is that sheath, which is very much so overlapping. You've got that one section of sheath wrapping right over the top of the other section of sheath. And then the ligule here is still membranous, but quite a bit more fringed or hairy than jointed goat grass. And then the leaf blade margins have no hairs, and there's no auricles at all. So you can see quite a bit of difference just in this vegetative portion of the plant. I've provided a key to the species that we're going to cover in this presentation. Now again, we only cover 20-some different grass species in this presentation, and there are many, many more in our region, but these are just the most common ones that I've run into in NRCS practices and plantings, and restoration grasses as well as weeds. So this will get you fairly close in most situations. There's going to always be some that aren't in this presentation though. So again, I would recommend another key or picture book to follow up with your identification. So if you want to, you can print these next 2 pages off and go along with the presentation, or I just kind of go step by step for the rest of the way. So the first big group we're going to look at are the grasses with the panicled inflorescence. You can see some examples there in the photographs. And within the panicled inflorescence, so the first step is to decide if the glooms are equal to or longer than the floret. And you can see in this photograph the glooms, which are the outside structures, are quite a bit longer than the florets inside. And then the second step of this key asks if the awns are arising from the back of the lemma. And you can see the awn, which is that long tail-like structure, instead of coming out from the tip of the end of the floret, or that lemma, it comes from the midsection of the back. And this gets us to oats and their relatives. And the first species that we want to get out of the way is Ventinata dubia, or Ventinata. This is a annual noxious weed. It's becoming more and more common throughout Idaho, probably making its way to Utah. You can see in the picture of the florets that it's got that awn arising from the back of the lemma, and it's got that twist in the middle. That's called a geniculate awn. Has a very loose open panicle. It's a short grass, 6 to 10 inches tall in most cases, very kind of, I don't want to say fragile, but it has a light structure to it. It's a very small grass. Ventinata dubia. Doesn't look like much else that we have in our area. So if it's a larger plant with those large glooms and the geniculate awns arising from the back of the lemma, then it's going to be in the oat group. And we don't cover oats here, so we're going to skip to another group of grasses. Now this still is within that group with the glooms exceeding the length of the floret, but instead of the awns arising from the back or the midsection of the lemma, these arise from the end of the lemma itself. And this is the needle grasses. And I don't go into any more detail here or break these down any further, but if you have a mature floret, these are pretty easy to key out through the standard keys. But quickly look at the picture on the right. You're going to want to know that the needle tip of the needle grass is called the callus. That becomes important. And then the lemma in this one is very hard and rolled all the way around the palea. So it's quite difficult to get down inside there. But like I said, if you have a good floret that you can get an image of, then it's pretty easy to key these out. So still in the panicle group, but we're backing out to glooms being shorter than the florets, which you see here. And then the first group we'll take on here is those with large spikelets being greater than 15 millimeters, and this is going to be the bromes. There's a few annual bromes that we run into repeatedly in the Intermountain West, and most people are, just automatically call them all cheatgrass, but there's a few distinctions to be made. So if the lemmas are long and narrow, and it has a long awn coming off the tip of it, then this is cheatgrass in the top right there. And notice in the top right, at the tip of the lemma, it's kind of got a little cleft in it. That's common among the bromes. If the lemmas, however, are short and broad, then we've got these two other weedy bromes. If the panicle is open and loose and kind of drooping like you see there, then this is Japanese brome, Bromus japonicus. If the pedicels, the flowering stems are shorter, making the spikelets be held more upright and tight, then this is Bromus mollis. We've got a couple perennial bromes that I cover here. The first one, if the lemmas are awnless, then it's going to be smooth brome, Bromus inermis, our normal forage grass. It's kind of everywhere now. And if it's an awned lemma, then it's going to be Bromus riparius or Bromus carinatus. That's meadow brome or mountain brome. And you see there on the left side, a lot of bromes have this M kind of printed on the leaf. It's very distinct in smooth brome. Okay, so now we're going into that same group, but we're going to look at those with small spikelets. The spikelets are less than 15 millimeters, and the lemmas are rounded on the back. So in that group, if the lemmas are awned and the blades are quite narrow and stiff, then you're probably looking at Idaho fescue. This is a small bunch grass, very fine stiff leaves, short ligule, and distinctly awned at the tip of the lemma. If the lemmas are awnless in this group and the blades are kind of flatter and soft and have that boat tip, looks like the prow of a boat on it, then we're looking at POA, or the bluegrasses. And the first bluegrass we'll look at is bulbous bluegrass. This one has the florets turn quickly into these little bulbs that look like small onion plants. And this happens as the plant or as the florets mature. So if you look at a very immature floret, it's going to look like a regular POA. But if it matures a little bit, then they're going to get this purplish little onion-like bulblet on it. And then the base of the plant also has a swollen bulb-like appearance to it. If you're in the POAs and you have very small plants with short leaves on it, then it's probably one of the POA secunda group. Secund meaning a compressed panicle, like you see in the top right. It's usually pressed around the stem. And POA secunda has several relatives. Taxonomists either lump these or split these. But POA secunda, this one you see here, is probably the most common. We also have POA ampla, which is a much larger grass with much longer blades on it and a bluish tint. This one is the variety Sherman, which is really commonly used in NRCS practices and other restoration plantings. So this one's out there quite a bit. You'll see it on the landscape. POA ampla. And like I said, there's a few other POA secunda relatives that aren't terribly easy to key out, but these are the main two. So now we're leaving the panicled group and going to cover a group of grasses with a spike or spike-like inflorescence. So the first group, we're going to talk about those with the lemmas and or the glooms having a long aund. And so the inflorescence itself has a bushy appearance. And so I lump all these in with the foxtails and squirreltails. The first one has a disarticulating rachis, meaning those little sections of rachilla break apart as the seeds mature. And so all of these sections fall to the ground instead of the glooms being left on the stem. And then we're looking at those with spikelets of 3 per node, with the middle one larger and the outer 2 reduced. These are the hordeums, or the barley group. So if you look at that picture on the right, you see coming up from the bottom that there's several skinny, narrow structures. Those are the glooms. And then the larger structures inside the glooms are the florets. And so each section of a hordeum that breaks off of the plant has this triplet of spikelets. So you've got 3 sets of glooms and 3 florets. Usually the one in the middle is quite a bit larger, and the ones on the outside are reduced or even sterile, but they'll always break off in these sections of 3. Okay, if it doesn't break off in those triplet sections, there's 1 or 2 spikelets per node, but it's still got that bushy appearance, then you're probably looking at Elymus elymoides. This is bottlebrush squirreltail, or one of its relatives. These are perennials, and they do look quite a bit like those barleys, but if you look at them close, there's only 1 spikelet per node, or 2, but never 3. So if you look at that picture in the middle, most of what you're looking at is glooms and awns, and the florets are kind of packed down inside. Now on the right, you'll see foxtail barley, which looks a lot like bottlebrush squirreltail, but it's an annual, and it's got much longer and softer glooms and awns on it. And again, it would break off into those triplet sections. So if the rachis remains intact and only the florets fall out, leaving the rest of the structures behind, then you might be looking at medusa head, Tiniatherum caput medusae. Another plant to consider is the Ceteria viridis, or one of our true foxtails. But in our range lands and the drier sites, it's often going to be medusa head, which doesn't look like anything else. It's an annual. You're always going to find it in these dense, dense mats of vegetation with those long awns and appendages sticking out. So now we're going to a group with narrow, non-bushy spikes. So it's still a spike, but it's not what you would call a foxtail. So we're going to break out the annuals first, and the first one we'll get out of the way is jointed goat grass. It just doesn't look like anything else. The inflorescence is definitely spike-like, and it's in these strange segmented portions. So each one of those little chunks is a spikelet with the glooms and the floret inside. But it looks very jointed. Yeah, not much else to say about that. Jointed goat grass. Another annual we're seeing quite a bit of is this false annual wheatgrass, Eremopyrum tritissium. To me, it looks like a very small, stunted, crested wheatgrass. But it is an annual. You'll see it early in the spring, and then it dries out by June. And then just a quick note, since we're in these annual wheatgrasses with spikes, your common cereal grains like wheat and triticale and rye would fall out here too. So we'll look at perennial plants with the spike-like inflorescence, and the first group has spikelets, one per node, and they're closely imbricate or pectinate, and this is crested wheatgrass, or the genus Agropyron. There's two I'll separate out here, crested wheatgrass, Agropyron cristatum, and Siberian wheatgrass, Agropyron fragile. Crested wheatgrass has a shorter, broader inflorescence to it, and if you looked at it from the top down, it would be kind of a flattened X like you see there, and to me they look like a filleted fish, the bones remaining. Siberian wheatgrass is much longer and narrower. The florets don't have awns on them, so they're not quite as spiky looking. And if you looked at it from the top down, it would be much more square, the X in cross section. And so we now go to those with spikelets 2 or more per node, or if one, then not closely imbricate. So basically anything that doesn't look like a crested wheatgrass. The first group we're going to look at has subulate glooms. That means awl-shaped, and you've got a picture of an awl there, a leather-working awl. And so these glooms are very long and skinny and less leaf-like than some of the other grasses we've seen. So if you look at the image on the right, you can see the long, skinny structures. Those are the glooms. And then the broader structures are going to be the lemmas of the florets. And if the glooms, so the central line of the glooms and the central line or the keel of the lemma do not line up, then we're going to be looking at the wild rye's, the genus Sathrostachys and genus Laemus. If you look in the middle, there's a picture of that POA spikelet again, and you can see how the midrib of the glooms and the lemmas are all falling in line. So yeah, the wild rye's will have the subulate glooms, and they won't be lined up with the lemmas. And if you're in the wild rye group and you've got a strongly rhizomatous plant of semi-wet or wet meadows, then it's probably Laemus triticioides, creeping wild rye. And you can see again with that close-up picture, it's got the narrow glooms, and the glooms do not line up with the center of the lemma. These can be similar in appearance to western wheatgrass to me, but western's slightly different. It wouldn't have the glooms being so narrow. It wouldn't have the glooms and lemmas being offset like that. And it would have flatter blades. Yeah. So if you're in the wild rye group, but you've got a bunch grass, then we've got a couple to look at. The first one is a bunch grass of extremely arid sites, leaves being mostly down at the base. You don't see many leaves breaking off of those stems above the base, 2 to 3 feet tall. This is Russian wild rye, Sathrostachys juncea, and it would have those same glooms and lemmas that we've seen in the previous pictures. These are used in very dry restoration sites and in fire breaks and other applications in the arid countries. If you've got a wild rye that's a bunch grass and it's quite a bit taller, 4 to 6 feet tall, and sometimes in more moist areas, then you've probably got basin wild rye, Lamus cinereus. So now we've backed up and we're going to look at plants with broader gloom, so more leaf-like, more similar to a regular lemma, and that midrib of the gloom lines up with the midrib of the next lemma above it. So this is going to be the true wheatgrasses. So we'll look at some rhizomatous wheatgrasses first. First thing you want to do is look at the glooms, and if they're blunt or truncate to obtuse, then you've probably got Thinopyrum intermedium, or intermediate wheatgrass. Again, this is rhizomatous, and it has the blunt glooms. It's very easy to identify with those two structures. If the glooms are sharp-pointed or on, and again we're looking at rhizomatous ones, and then if it has a very flat and very broad leaf blade, then this is quackgrass, Elymus repens. It's got a good imbricate inflorescence on it. Sometimes can have small awns on the tips of the florets and glooms, but the thing to look for is just a good, strong sod-forming grass with very flat, very broad leaf blades. If you've got leaf blades that are involute or rolled, or if they are flat, then the blade is less than 5 millimeters wide. Then we go to this next group. The first one has rigid glooms that are widest near the base. So if you look at that image on the right and find a gloom, you'll see that they're widest very close to the point of attachment to the stem, and then they taper gradually up to the tip of the gloom. So this is western wheatgrass, Pascopyrum smithii. Very densely rhizomatous. You won't find this making bunches like some of the other grasses. And most often you'll find that it has a light bluish glaucous color to it. And it does tend to like drier sites than quackgrass. If the glooms aren't quite as rigid, they're a little softer, and they're widest at or above the middle. So if you look at that picture on the right, you've got the point of attachment, and then as you go up the gloom, it gets broader and broader to the middle and then tapers to the tip. Then this is thick spike wheatgrass or streambank wheatgrass, Elymus lanceolatus. Again, this is rhizomatous, but in really dry sites, typically very similar to western. So this one you'll want to remember these floral structures to it. And finally, we're going to look at the wheatgrasses that are not rhizomatous or that are bunch grasses. The first one is very similar to intermediate wheatgrass that we looked at earlier. It has the blunt or truncate glooms on it, but instead of being rhizomatous, this one's a bunch grass. This is Thinopyrum ponticum, or tall wheatgrass. Very similar in appearance to intermediate. And you know, if tall wheatgrass is growing in a pasture and in a setting where there's lots of plants close together, or if intermediate plants get kind of clumped together, you know, sometimes the only way to tell them apart is to dig up some roots and see if there's rhizomes or not. If the glooms aren't blunt or truncate, and they're long-awned, and you can see these awns kind of spiral away from the floret, then we're looking at Pseudorognaria spicata, or blue bunch wheatgrass. One of our most common grasses in the Intermountain West, or at least it used to be, and it's one of the most commonly seeded grasses by NRCS and other restorationists. I'll mention here, this does look almost identical to Snake River wheatgrass, and most people would have a hard time keying them apart. So I just lump them together here, and that would be Elymus wawaensis. But yeah, right here is blue bunch wheatgrass, Pseudorognaria spicata. And then if you've got glooms that are more than 2/3 as long as the spikelet, and bunch grass, small anthers compared to blue bunch, and short awns, Then this is slender wheatgrass, Elymus trichicollis. The leaf blades are wide and green, very similar to quackgrass, but it is a bunch grass. It wouldn't have rhizomes in most cases, although there is a weakly rhizomatous slender wheatgrass that recently got released by the ARS. So can be rhizomatous, but typically a bunch grass. And then the look of the inflorescence is quite a bit different from quackgrass. It's not nearly as imbricate. The florets are much more overlapping here in slender. And that concludes this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us at the PMC, and we would be happy to look at specimens or look at photographs and help with identification of any of your grasses or any other plants. Thank you very much.